They called it a joke when the lawyer handed him a brass key the size of a matchstick. But 24 hours later, that same lawyer drove him into the Blue Ridge Mountains and unlocked a door that hadn't been opened in 7 years. Behind it was a truth worth $60 million and a family secret ugly enough to destroy an empire. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below. Shall we begin? The conference room on the 14th floor of Pryor and Associates smelled like old mahogany and fresh printer paper. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed downtown Asheville, North Carolina, the distant Blue Ridge Mountains half hidden behind a curtain of November rain. Miles Kearney sat in a chair that probably cost more than his monthly rent. His weathered hands rested on the polished table. A faded army field jacket hung loose on his broad frame, its patches worn smooth by decades. A thin scar ran along his left jaw, disappearing beneath the collar of a flannel shirt he'd owned since before the Gulf War. At his feet, a large German shepherd named Sentry lay perfectly still. The dog's dark eyes moved slowly across the room, tracking every person the way he once tracked movement along patrol routes in Fallujah. His black and tan coat caught the overhead light. Every few seconds his tail tapped once against the carpet when Miles shifted his boot. Across the table sat the Pryor family. Colleen Pryor crossed her legs and checked her phone without looking up. Her designer handbag sat on the table like a small declaration of territory. Beside her, Blake Pryor leaned back with his arms folded, already smirking before the reading had begun. He wore a tailored navy suit and a watch that caught the light every time he moved his wrist. Miles knew he didn't belong in this room. 2 years ago, he'd been part of this world, married to Colleen, trusted by her father, Edmund Pryor, the man who built Pryor Consolidated Lumber into the largest private timber operation east of the Mississippi. Edmund had once told Miles over bourbon on the back porch that he was the only honest man left in the family. But honesty didn't hold up in divorce court. Colleen's attorneys had stripped him clean. The house, the truck, the savings from 22 years in the Army. When the papers were signed, Miles walked out with a duffel bag, $600, and the one living thing that had never betrayed him. Sentry. The lawyer at the head of the table cleared his throat. Raymond Sills was a tall man with careful eyes and silver hair combed straight back. He opened a leather binder and adjusted his reading glasses. This is the last will and testament of Edmund James Pryor. The room went still. Edmund Pryor had been a force across the southern Appalachians, a man who built sawmills with his own hands and turned mountain timber into a business worth hundreds of millions. Hard, fair, old-fashioned in ways that made younger men uncomfortable. Miles had spent the last 18 months of Edmund's life driving him to chemotherapy appointments, fixing the broken gutters on the farmhouse, sitting beside him on quiet evenings while the old man watched the fog settle over the ridgeline. Sometimes Edmund would reach down and rest his hand on Sentry's head. "That dog's got more backbone than my entire board of directors," he'd said once. Now Edmund was gone, and this room was about to divide everything he'd built. Sills began reading. "To my daughter, Colleen Pryor Kearney, the lakefront estate in Highlands, along with investment accounts valued at approximately $9 million. Colleen nodded once without looking up from her phone. "To my son, Blake Pryor, controlling interest in Pryor Consolidated Lumber, including operational authority over all subsidiaries." Blake grinned slowly. "Well-deserved," he murmured. Miles said nothing. Sentry lifted his head briefly, then settled again. The reading continued. Trust funds, commercial properties, vehicles. Millions passed from one name to another in the calm, practiced rhythm of legal language. Finally, Sills turned to the last page. "And now, a personal bequest." Blake leaned forward with a smirk. Colleen folded her arms. Several heads turned, in recognition of his devoted companionship during my final years, and to preserve the legal integrity of this document. Sills paused. "I leave Miles Kearney one brass key." Silence filled the room. Then Blake laughed. "One key?" He looked around at the relatives. "That's poetic." A few others chuckled softly. Colleen didn't laugh. She looked at Miles with an expression that landed somewhere between pity and dismissal. Maybe it opens a storage unit, she said coolly. Sills reached beneath the table and produced a small wooden box. Inside, resting on dark velvet, was a single brass key no longer than 2 inches. He slid the box across the table. It stopped in front of Miles. Sentry stood and looked at the key, then at Miles. Miles stared at the small piece of metal for a long time. The room waited. He could feel their eyes, the amusement, the quiet cruelty of people who had never once wondered where their next meal would come from. He reached forward and picked up the key. It was warm from being under the light. He turned it over once in his calloused fingers. Then he slid it into his jacket pocket. He stood. Sentry rose beside him. Guess that's what 22 years of service buys you these days, Miles said quietly. Blake snorted. Miles turned and walked toward the door. Nobody called after him. The elevator ride felt like sinking. When the doors opened onto the street, cold mountain rain hit his face. Asheville looked gray and small beneath the low clouds. Sentry walked close beside him, shoulder against Miles's leg. Miles pulled the key from his pocket and held it in the rain. Brass glinted under the streetlight. Sentry pressed his nose gently against Miles's wrist. Come on, partner. They walked through the rain toward the old Chevy parked 3 blocks away. Neither of them knew yet that the small piece of metal in Miles's pocket was about to unlock something. Edmund Pryor had spent 7 years hiding in the mountains, or that by the end of the month, the people laughing in that conference room would wish they had never heard of Pryor, Consolidated Lumber. The rain followed them all the way home. Miles's truck groaned up the narrow road into the hills outside Marshall, North Carolina, windshield wipers struggling against the downpour. Sentry sat in the passenger seat with his head near the window, watching the dark trees slide past. The cabin was small, rented month to month, set back against a stand of hemlocks on a dirt road that turned to mud every time it rained. Miles cut the engine and sat for a moment, listening to the ticking of the cooling motor. Inside, he tossed a log into the wood stove and waited for the flames to catch. Sentry circled twice on the braided rug and lay down near the heat. The cabin smelled like cedar smoke and coffee grounds. Miles dropped into the wooden chair beside the stove and took the brass key from his pocket again. He turned it slowly in the firelight. No markings, no label. Just smooth brass worn slightly at the edges. He set it on the table beside a cold cup of coffee. What did you leave me, old man? Sentry lifted his head. A crack of thunder rolled across the ridgeline. Not loud, just a low rumble that shook the window panes. Miles froze. His breathing changed. His fingers tightened around armrests. The fire popped and hissed. Another roll of thunder, closer now. And suddenly, the cabin walls felt like the inside of an armored vehicle. Heat and dust, and the shriek of metal tearing apart. The sharp crack of an IED somewhere ahead on the convoy road. Voices shouting through static. Miles's jaw clenched. His knuckles went white. Sentry was already moving. The big shepherd crossed the room in 2 steps and pressed his body hard against Miles's legs. The dog pushed his head under Miles's trembling hand and held still. Warm, heavy, present. Miles closed his eyes. His breath came in short, tight pulls. Sentry leaned harder, patient, steady. The same weight he'd pressed against Miles's body in a VA hospital room 4 years ago, when the nightmares had been so bad the nurses stopped coming in. Slowly, the cabin came back. The fire, the rain, the dog's warm breath on his knuckles. Miles exhaled and opened his eyes. He looked down at Sentry. Still watching out for me, huh? Sentry's tail swept the floor once. Miles leaned forward and pressed his forehead against the dog's broad skull. They stayed like that for a long time. He slept eventually. Not well, but enough. Sometime before dawn, Sentry's ears snapped forward. The dog stood and faced the door with a low growl barely loud enough to hear. Miles opened his eyes. Headlights washed across the window. Tires crunched on the muddy drive. He moved to the window. A black sedan sat in the rain beside his truck, the engine still running. A tall man stepped out, pulling a long coat tight against the weather. Raymond Sills. Miles opened the door halfway. Cold air and rain pushed inside. It's 5 in the morning, counselor. Sills removed his hat. I'm aware, Mr. Kearney. I apologize for the hour. Sentry watched from behind Miles's leg, unblinking. The Pryors send you? Sills shook his head. No. He paused. Edmund sent me. Sills looked at the key-shaped bulge in Miles's jacket pocket. That key was not a parting joke, he said quietly. It was the beginning. Miles leaned against the doorframe. Beginning of what? Of your real inheritance. Sentry's tail moved slowly. The dog stepped forward and sniffed the lawyer's coat. After a moment, he sat down calmly. Sills reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folded topographic map. May I come inside? Miles stepped aside. The map spread across the kitchen table showed a section of ridgeline deep in the Pisgah National Forest. Red pencil marks circled a hollow between two steep slopes. Sills tapped the spot. 112 acres. Purchased privately through a holding company 8 years ago. No public record connects it to Edmund Pryor. Miles studied the map. This is just mountain forest. Sills met his eyes. That's what it looks like. But Edmund built something there. Something he kept hidden from his son, Blake. The name hung in the air. Edmund discovered 3 years ago that Blake had been systematically embezzling from Pryor Consolidated, Sills said. Shell companies, falsified contracts, offshore accounts. Millions diverted over the course of a decade. Miles exhaled slowly. Why didn't he go to the authorities? Because Blake controlled the board. If Edmund went public, the company would collapse. 4,000 employees across the Carolinas and Virginia would lose their jobs overnight. Sills folded his hands. So Edmund built a different plan. Miles stared at the map for a long time. Then he looked at the brass key. What does this open? Sills stood. I'll show you. The sedan climbed deep into the Pisgah forest on roads that barely qualified as roads. Rain hammered the windshield. Sentry sat in the back seat, nose pressed to the glass, watching the dark trees with absolute focus. They drove for nearly an hour before the pavement ended entirely. The car bounced along a gravel track that wound through dense rhododendron and old-growth oak. Fog clung to the ridgeline above them. Finally, the track ended at a clearing. An old stone and timber lodge sat in the center, its roof covered in moss, windows dark. A weathered barn stood behind it. Miles stepped out. Cold mountain air filled his lungs. Sentry jumped down beside him and immediately lowered his nose to the ground. The dog moved toward the barn with purpose, sniffing in quick, focused bursts. Miles watched him. What are you on to? Sentry reached the barn door and began pawing at the ground. Snow and dead leaves scattered beneath his claws. He barked once. Sharp, Miles walked over and brushed the debris aside. His hand struck metal, a steel plate set flush with the ground. A heavy brass lock sat recessed into its surface. Miles looked at Sills. The lawyer nodded toward his pocket. Miles pulled out the key. It slid into the lock and turned with a clean, solid click. The hatch lifted with a groan of old hinges. A metal ladder descended into darkness. Cold, dry air drifted upward. Edmund built this in 2019, Sills said. Originally, it was a storm shelter. Then he repurposed it. Miles climbed down. Sentry followed, landing softly on the concrete floor below. The space was enormous. Reinforced concrete walls stretched 40 feet in every direction. Steel shelving lined the walls. Emergency generators hummed faintly somewhere deeper in the structure. Motion-activated lights flickered on as Miles moved through the room. At the far end stood a heavy steel door with a combination lock. Sills descended behind them. The evidence vault, he said. Miles turned the combination. Sills gave him. The door opened with a deep metallic sound. Inside was a room carved into the mountain rock. A steel desk, filing cabinets, hard drives stacked neatly on shelves, and on the desk a single envelope with Miles's name written across it in Edmund Pryor's unmistakable handwriting. Miles picked it up. Sentry sat beside him, watching. He opened it. Miles, if you're reading this, then the key did its job. You were never meant to feel insulted. The key was the only legal way I could pass you the truth without my children destroying it before you ever saw it. Miles swallowed hard. You drove me to every appointment. You rebuilt the porch railing when nobody else remembered it was broken. You sat with me on evenings when the pain got bad, And you never once asked for anything in return. Your dog reminded me what loyalty looks like. Sentry has more honor in one paw than my son has in his entire body. Miles glanced down. Sentry looked back at him with steady amber eyes. The letter continued. Blake has stolen over $60 million from this company through a network of shell corporations and fraudulent contracts. I hired forensic accountants. The proof is in this room. Every transaction, every forged document, every offshore account. I have placed $60 million of my personal assets into a protected trust. The trust activates only when Blake's crimes are exposed and he is removed from the company. If you choose to walk away, the money goes to federal investigators and the company dies. 4,000 families lose their income. I am not asking for revenge. I am asking for justice. You are a soldier. You know what it means to fight for people who cannot fight for themselves. Miles lowered the letter. The bunker was silent except for the hum of the generator. He looked at Sills. How long have you known? 5 years. Miles rubbed his face. I fix gutters and chop firewood for a living. I don't know anything about corporate fraud. Sills gestured toward the evidence room. You won't be alone. Edmund assembled a team. They arrived the next morning. Teresa Vance, a forensic accountant in her late 30s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense voice. And Liam Chow, 26, a cyber analyst who carried 2 laptops and spoke in a rapid shorthand Miles barely understood. Teresa spread financial documents across the bunker desk. Blake's operation is layered. Shell companies routing money through 3 countries before it lands in accounts under fake names. Liam typed rapidly. I've already cracked 2 of his encrypted servers. The data confirms everything in Edmund's files. Miles stood with his arms crossed, Sentry beside him. What's the timeline? Teresa pointed to a date circled on her whiteboard. The Appalachian Heritage Gala, Charlottesville. 3 weeks from now. Blake plans to finalize a major acquisition deal that will permanently bury the money trail. Liam looked up. Once that deal closes, the evidence becomes nearly impossible to prosecute. Miles nodded slowly. Then we stop it before that. The weeks that followed ran like a military operation. Teresa built a timeline of every stolen dollar. Liam dismantled Blake's digital firewalls one by one. Sills prepared the legal framework, and Miles did what soldiers do. He moved quietly and gathered what was needed. The first field operation took them to a private warehouse outside Knoxville where Blake stored falsified shipping records. Miles and Sentry approached at dusk through a tree line behind the property. The dog moved in silence beside him, low to the ground, ears forward, exactly the way he'd been trained during deployments. They slipped through a gap in the perimeter fence. Sentry cleared the building's exterior in seconds, circling back to nudge Miles's hand. Clear. Inside, Miles photographed crates with mismatched shipping codes, falsified manifests, evidence of inventory being sold to companies that didn't exist. Sentry froze mid-step. His ears snapped upright. Footsteps. A security guard rounded the corner with a flashlight. The beam swept across the floor. Miles pressed flat behind a stack of crates. Sentry dropped silently beside him. The guard paused, swept the light again, then moved on. Miles exhaled. They slipped out through the same gap in the fence and disappeared into the tree line. But 2 nights later, on the second run to a different storage facility outside Roanoke, things went wrong. Miles was inside a filing office copying documents when Sentry suddenly pressed hard against his leg. The dog's body vibrated with tension. A door burst open. 2 private security guards rushed in. Hey, stop right there! Miles grabbed the documents and moved fast. Sentry surged ahead of him through the hallway, barking once to clear the path. They hit the fire exit at a sprint. Behind them, 1 guard shouted into a radio. The other fired a warning shot into the ceiling. Sentry yelped. A piece of ceiling debris had struck the dog's right shoulder. Not a bullet, but sharp enough to cut through fur and skin. Blood appeared instantly against his dark coat. Miles's heart slammed against his ribs. Sentry. The dog stumbled but kept running. They burst through the exit into cold night air. Teresa had the SUV waiting 50 yards down the access road. Miles lifted Sentry into the back seat and pressed his jacket against the wound. The dog whimpered softly but didn't struggle. His eyes stayed locked on Miles's face. "You're all right," Miles whispered. "You're all right, partner." Sentry licked his hand. Teresa drove hard through the dark Virginia hills. Back at the bunker, Miles cleaned and bandaged the wound with the same steady hands that had treated injuries in field hospitals 20 years before. The cut wasn't deep, painful, but survivable. Sentry lay on the concrete floor afterward, breathing slowly. Miles sat beside him all night, one hand resting on the dog's ribs, feeling the steady rise and fall. "You've taken hits for me before," Miles murmured. "You don't have to keep doing that." Sentry's tail tapped once against the floor. The gala arrived on a cold December evening. Charlottesville glowed with holiday lights. The Heritage Grand Hotel rose against the dark sky, its ballroom windows shining gold. Miles adjusted the collar of a borrowed suit jacket. It didn't fit perfectly, but it didn't need to. Sentry walked beside him in a simple black harness, the scar on his shoulder hidden beneath his thick winter coat. Inside, the ballroom was everything Miles expected and nothing he wanted. Crystal chandeliers, string quartet, hundreds of guests in gowns and tuxedos holding champagne and talking about money. Blake Pryor stood at the center of it all, tall, polished, radiating the effortless confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable. He laughed loudly with a circle of investors, raising his glass as a photographer captured the moment. Blake noticed Miles from across the room. His smile cooled. He walked over. "Well," Blake said, "look who crawled down from the mountains." A few nearby guests turned to watch. Blake glanced at Sentry. "You brought the mutt to a black tie event?" Miles met his eyes calmly. Edmund always said Sentry had better judgment than most people in suits. Blake's jaw tightened. He leaned closer. "I know someone broke into my Roanoke office." His voice dropped. "If you think some old soldier and a dog can touch me, you're even more pathetic than I thought." Miles said nothing. Blake turned and walked toward the stage. The lights dimmed. Blake stepped to the podium. The room fell silent. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight marks a new era for Pryor Consolidated Lumber." Applause. Behind the stage, Teresa murmured into her earpiece, "Liam, now." Liam pressed a key. The giant screen behind Blake flickered. His prepared slides vanished. In their place, financial documents appeared. Wire transfers, shell company registrations, bank statements showing millions moving through accounts under false names. The room murmured in confusion. Blake turned. His face went white. "What the hell is this?" Teresa stepped forward from the crowd. Her voice carried clearly. "These documents show a decade of financial fraud within Pryor Consolidated Lumber. Every record has been transmitted to federal investigators." The ballroom erupted. Reporters surged forward. Board members whispered in tight clusters. Cameras flashed in rapid bursts. Blake gripped the podium. "This is fabricated. Someone shut those screens off." Nobody moved. Miles walked slowly through the parting crowd. Sentry moved beside him. The ballroom went quiet as they approached the stage. Miles reached the podium. He looked at Blake for a long moment. Then he placed something on the polished wood surface. The brass key. It sat there under the ballroom lights, small and ordinary. "Your father knew exactly what he was doing," Miles said quietly. "Every dollar, every lie, he saw all of it." Blake stared at the key. His voice came out hoarse. He was a senile old man. Miles shook his head. He was the only one in this family who understood what the word honor means. Federal agents entered through the main doors. "Mr. Pryor," one of them said calmly, "we need you to come with us." Blake looked around the ballroom. The investors, the board members, the cameras recording every second. The empire he had built on stolen money was collapsing in front of 500 witnesses. Security escorted him out through the stunned crowd. The room fell into an uneven silence. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras kept flashing. Miles didn't answer any of them. He simply knelt beside Sentry and scratched behind the dog's ears. "We did it, old man." Sentry's tail swept the marble floor once. Across the ballroom, Teresa and Liam exchanged exhausted smiles. Sills stood near the wall, watching the final act of Edmund Pryor's plan unfold, precisely as the old man had designed it years before. Spring came slowly to the Blue Ridge. Dogwood blossoms opened white and pink along the ridgelines. The creeks that had frozen solid in December now ran fast and clear through the hollows. 6 months had passed since Charlottesville. Blake Pryor sat in a federal courtroom awaiting trial. Pryor Consolidated Lumber survived. Miles had restructured the company's leadership, installed transparent oversight, and protected every one of the 4,000 jobs Edmund had worried about. The $60 million trust was unlocked. Miles used it exactly the way Edmund would have wanted. The old lodge and the 112 acres deep in the Pisgah forest became something new. A place where veterans could come with service dogs and stay as long as they needed. No paperwork, no waiting lists. Just mountain air, quiet trails, and dogs that understood things words couldn't reach. On a warm May morning, Miles stood on the porch of the restored lodge, watching a group of veterans work with young German shepherds on the training field below. Some of the men moved stiffly, carrying wounds that would never fully heal. Others paused mid-stride sometimes, their eyes going distant for a moment before coming back. Miles knew that look. He'd worn it himself for years. Sentry sat beside him. The scar on his shoulder was barely visible now beneath the thick fur that had grown back. The dog watched the field with calm authority, like a retired sergeant who still showed up to formation every morning out of habit. A younger veteran struggled with a nervous pup that kept pulling sideways on the leash. Miles walked over. Sentry followed. "Ease up on the grip," Miles said gently. The young man looked up, embarrassed. Miles knelt beside the pup. "They mirror you. If you're wound tight, they feel it." Sentry stepped forward and touched his nose to the young dog's face. The pup stopped pulling and sniffed back cautiously. Then its tail began to wag. The veteran laughed quietly for what might have been the first time in months. "See," Miles said. "He knows what he's doing better than either of us." The screen door opened behind them. Teresa stepped out holding a folder. "Board voted again," she said. "They want you to stay on as permanent chairman." Miles shook his head slowly and watched a hawk circle above the ridgeline. "I spent 22 years learning how to clear buildings and survive ambushes. Still not sure how I ended up running a lumber company." Teresa shrugged. "Edmund saw something in you." Miles looked across the ranch. He thought about the brass key, the conference room laughter, the long night in the cabin when thunder sent him back to a road in Iraq, and the only thing that brought him home was 80 pounds of German shepherd pressing against his chest. Sills appeared on the porch, carrying a small shadow box with a glass front. Inside, mounted on dark felt, was the brass key. "I thought this should live here," Sills said. Miles took it and walked inside. He hung the frame on the stone wall above the fireplace. Late afternoon light from the window fell across the glass. Sentry followed him in and lay down beside the hearth. Miles stood there for a moment looking at the key behind the glass. Such a small thing. Light enough to lose in a coat pocket. Ordinary enough to throw away without a second thought. But it had unlocked everything. He knelt beside Sentry and rested a hand on the dog's warm neck. "Good work, partner," he whispered. Sentry's tail thumped softly against the stone floor. Outside, the ridge glowed amber in the fading light. The sound of laughter drifted up from the training field, where veterans and dogs moved together through the tall grass. The lodge that had been dark and forgotten for years now carried the noise of life returning, and in the quiet space above the fireplace, a small brass key caught the last of the daylight and held it. Sometimes the smallest things carried the greatest weight. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear from you. Just drop a simple comment below. Type 1 if you believe loyalty like Sentry's still exists in this world. Or type 0 if you think stories like this remind us what real courage looks like. You don't need to write anything long. Just a single number lets me know you were here watching with us. And if you enjoy stories about brave veterans, loyal dogs, and second chances in life, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Because the next story is already waiting, and it might be even more powerful than this one. So stay with us. More incredible stories are coming soon.